Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Right now, a 5,000-year-old dead king buried in central China, a genetically hacked chicken egg sitting in some agricultural lab, and a massive traffic jam of oil tankers idling in the Middle East. They're all connected by this one invisible thread.
They are.
And usually, when we talk about how the world works, we have this expectation of total visibility. We want the world to operate like a vintage mechanical clock.
Right, where you can see all the pieces.
Exactly. You pop the back casing off, you look inside, and you can clearly see the gears turning, the mainspring uncoiling, and the escapement ticking. You can point right at it and say, there it is. That brass gear turns that steel gear, and that is exactly why the hands on the face of the clock are moving.
It is a very comforting illusion, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a linear, highly visible chain of cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense to our primate brains. We desperately like things to be tangible. I mean, we want the events of our lives to be easily categorized into a simple equation where A causes B, and then we can all go home and sleep soundly.
Yeah, if only it were that easy.
Right. But the reality of our geopolitical and technological landscape is, well, it's infinitely more opaque.
Exactly, because when you step back and actually look at the engines driving our modern world today, suddenly that clockwork isn't just invisible, it is overwhelmingly vast.
Yes, vast and deeply complicated.
Right. We are looking at a landscape governed by hidden algorithms that are quietly rewriting human psychology. We're talking about literal microscopic genetic edits occurring within livestock that could upend the entire global pharmaceutical industry. And we are looking at these incredibly narrow geographic choke points that you cannot see from the window of your local grocery store, but they absolutely dictate the price of the bread you are buying.
It is the absolute definition of a complex system. And that is exactly what we are mapping out today.
Yeah, it is.
So welcome to the deep dive. If you are listening to this right now, you, the learner, the person who refuses to just skim the headline, feel a spike of anxiety and move on, you are in the exact right place.
You really are.
Today is designed to be a masterclass in seeing the bigger picture. We are going to relentlessly look for the why and the how behind the cascading events of today's world. Our goal is to find the connective tissue between seemingly entirely unrelated phenomena.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is ambitious, to say the least. We are cutting straight through the noise of the daily news cycle to find the hidden architecture of the present moment.
It's a big task.
It is, and to do that properly, to get the right perspective on all the chaos happening down here on the ground, we actually need to start by looking up.
Okay.
We need to look at humanity's push outward into the vacuum.
It is the perfect vantage point, honestly. Space exploration has always served as a mirror for our terrestrial ambitions, our geopolitical rivalries, and our technological maturity.
Yeah.
And right now, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, is in the absolute final stages of preparing for a monumental event.
Yeah.
We are talking about the Artemis II mission.
Yes. Set for launch on April 1st, 2026. And we need to be clear here. This is not just another communications satellite being lobbed into low Earth orbit.
Not at all.
This is a crewed mission. We have 4 human beings: astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cuff, and Jeremy Hansen. They are going to strap into the Orion spacecraft, sit on top of millions of pounds of highly explosive rocket propellant, and take a 10-day journey around the moon and back.
It's incredible to even think about.
It is. I keep thinking about this, like the ultimate test drive before the ultimate road trip.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Like you don't just go out, buy a massive RV, and immediately try to drive it from New York down to Tierra del Fuego without checking the brakes.
No, you definitely want to take it around the neighborhood first.
Exactly. Artemis II is taking the RV around the lunar block to make sure we don't break down on the eventual, much longer road trip to Mars.
That analogy holds up incredibly well, particularly when you start looking at the sheer mind-boggling complexity of the Orion spacecraft's life support and deep space navigation systems. Artemis II is the very first crewed flight test of the Space Launch System rocket, the SLS, and the Orion capsule. But the reason this matters goes far beyond just proving the structural mechanics of the flight.
Okay, so what is the broader goal then?
This mission is fundamentally about establishing the operational protocols for a sustainable, permanent human presence off-world.
Let's dig into those protocols. What are we actually testing when we send 4 people around the moon for 10 days? Because I know it's not just a sightseeing tour.
Far from it. First, they are establishing physiological baselines. When you leave low Earth orbit, you leave the protective bubble of Earth's magnetosphere.
Right, the radiation shielding.
Exactly. You're passing through the Van Allen radiation belts and entering an environment bombarded by solar and cosmic radiation. We need precise data on how the human body reacts to that specific exposure over 10 days.
Makes sense.
Second, we are testing the psychological endurance of the crew in a deeply isolated environment.
Being trapped in a tin can for a week and a half?
Basically, yeah. But technologically, the biggest hurdle is testing the deep space communications network and how the crew interacts with the highly automated AI-assisted systems aboard Orion.
Because of the time delay?
Yes. If something goes wrong out there, the communication delay with Houston means the crew and the spacecraft's internal computers have to be able to diagnose and solve catastrophic failures autonomously.
Wow.
It is a massive transitional moment. We are moving from the era of visiting space, like the Apollo missions, to the era of actually inhabiting space.
And while we have human eyes preparing to look at the lunar surface up close, we have robotic eyes that are continuing to do the heavy, grinding, scientific lifting millions of miles further out on Mars.
Yes.
I am talking about the Curiosity rover. I feel like Curiosity is that incredibly reliable, slightly older coworker who just puts their head down, ignores the office drama, and gets the job done year after year.
That's a perfectly accurate description. Curiosity has been an absolute workhorse for planetary geologists.
It really has.
Right now, it is wrapping up its time at a very specific, highly unusual geological formation near Mount Sharp. It is navigating what scientists call boxwork terrain.
Boxwork.
Yeah. Curiosity has been analyzing this area between sols 4838 and 4844. A sol, for our listeners, is a Martian solar day, which is just about 39 minutes longer than an Earth day.
Okay, I need you to explain this boxwork terrain to me, because when I hear the word boxwork, I immediately picture a massive abandoned warehouse full of rotting cardboard boxes.
Right, which is definitely not what's on Mars.
Right. We are talking about Martian rocks. How does rock form a box?
Let's use a better metaphor to visualize the mechanics of how this forms. Imagine you take a wooden crate and you pour wet, highly durable concrete into all the tiny cracks and seams between the wooden planks.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You let that concrete dry until it is rock hard. Then you set the wooden crate on fire.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The wood completely burns away, but the concrete that seeped into the cracks remains, leaving behind a rigid, intersecting web-like grid that perfectly outlines where the wood used to be.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So what was the wood and what was the concrete on ancient Mars?
Brilliant question. We're talking about a period billions of years ago when Mars had abundant flowing groundwater. The wood in our metaphor was the existing, softer, sedimentary bedrock of Mars.
Okay.
That bedrock had fractures and faults. The groundwater, which was rich with dissolved minerals, seeped into those cracks.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Over long periods of time, those minerals precipitated out of the water, essentially crystallizing, and filled the cracks with a much harder substance, usually mineral veins. That was our concrete.
Right.
Millions of years later, the Martian climate changed. The water disappeared, and relentless wind erosion scoured the planet. The softer bedrock eroded away completely, leaving only those hardened mineral veins standing upright in this bizarre, intersecting, box-like pattern.
That is wild.
It is. Curiosity has been carefully examining specific structures within this ancient web named Solar de Maricunga and El Misti.
So it's essentially the fossilized ghost of ancient Martian groundwater.
Yeah.
The negative space of a lost ocean. That's hauntingly beautiful.
It really is.
And Curiosity is doing this analysis using laser spectrometry, right? Like literally zapping the rocks to see what they are made of.
Precisely. It uses an instrument called ChemCam. It fires a high-powered laser at a pinpoint area of the rock. The laser is so intense that it instantly vaporizes a tiny fraction of the rock, turning it into a glowing plasma that reaches thousands of degrees.
Wait, it creates literal plasma on the surface of Mars.
It does. And as that plasma cools, the atoms within it emit light at very specific wavelengths.
Oh, interesting.
The rover's built-in spectrometers then read that emitted light, because every chemical element produces a unique optical signature. A specific barcode of light scientists back on Earth can look at that data and determine the exact chemical composition of the rock.
That is so cool.
By collecting this in situ data, Curiosity is essentially reading the geological diary of Mars, paragraph by paragraph. It tells us exactly what the pH, the temperature, and the chemical makeup of that water was billions of years ago.
It is forensic science on a planetary scale. We are dusting for the fingerprints of ancient oceans.
We are.
But our vision as a species goes even further out than our own solar system. Let's talk about the really deep cosmos. NASA recently deployed the IXPE mission, that is the Imaging X-ray Polarimetry Explorer.
Yes.
And it recently teamed up with two other heavy hitters in the orbital telescope world, the Chandra X-ray Observatory and the European Space Agency's XMM Newton. They combined their focus to look at a specific supernova remnant called RCW86.
A supernova remnant is the rapidly expanding, incredibly turbulent cloud of superheated gas and dust that is left over after a massive star violently collapses and explodes.
Right.
RCW86 is a particularly famous target for astronomers because of its historical pedigree. It is widely believed to be the remnant of a supernova that was actually documented by Chinese astronomers back in the year 185 AD.
Wait, really? 185 AD?
Yes. They recorded it in their texts as a guest star that suddenly appeared in the sky, shone brightly for months, and then slowly faded away.
Which is incredible to think about. Someone standing in China nearly 2 millennia ago, looking up at the exact same explosion we are studying today.
It's a profound connection across time.
But looking at it with a standard optical telescope, the kind that just captures visible light, only gives you a tiny fraction of the picture, right?
Right, because the most violent energetic processes in the universe do not emit their primary energy as visible light. They emit it as X-rays.
Ah, okay.
When the shock wave of that exploding star slams into the surrounding interstellar gas at millions of miles per hour, it heats that gas to millions of degrees, generating intense X-rays. By combining the data from Chandra and XMM Newton, scientists were able to create a highly detailed, color-coded map showing the different energy levels of the explosion.
Like a heat map.
Exactly. Yellow for the lower energy X-rays, blue for the higher energy ones. But the real unprecedented breakthrough comes from IXPE. IXPE does something the others cannot do. It measures the polarization of those X-rays.
Okay, I need an ELI 5. Explain it like I'm 5 for polarization. Because when I hear that word, I just think of my polarized sunglasses that cut the harsh glare off the ocean when I go to the beach.
It is actually the exact same underlying principle in physics.
Really?
Yeah. Light, whether it is visible light or an X-ray, is an electromagnetic wave. As that wave travels through space, its electric field is vibrating. Normal, unpolarized light vibrates in all possible directions, simultaneously up, down, left, right, diagonally.
Okay, got it.
But when light is polarized, it means those vibrations have been forced to align and vibrate in predominantly one specific direction. Your sunglasses work by physically blocking the light waves that are vibrating horizontally, which is the glare reflecting off the water, and only letting the vertically vibrating light pass through.
Okay, I am with you. But how does that apply to a dead star? There's no giant pair of sunglasses out there in space.
No, there isn't. In the context of a supernova, the light becomes polarized not by a physical lens, but by extreme magnetic fields.
Oh.
As the electrons are caught in the shock wave of the explosion, they spiral around the magnetic field lines at nearly the speed of light, emitting X-rays.
Right.
The orientation of those X-rays, their polarization, is directly dictated by the direction of the magnetic field. So by mapping the polarization using IXPE, we are literally seeing the invisible magnetic skeleton of the supernova.
Wow.
We are mapping the magnetic force fields that act as giant particle accelerators, creating the cosmic rays that constantly bombard our galaxy.
It really does just make you feel delightfully, wonderfully small to know that there is a magnetic skeleton of a dead star out there that we can finally see.
It does.
And speaking of which, I have a call to action for you, the listener. A homework assignment, if you will. I want you to step outside on the evening of March 27. I want you to look toward the western horizon. If the sky is clear, you are going to see a waxing crescent moon. And right next to it, swinging incredibly close in the sky, is the Beehive star cluster.
Also known as M44.
Yes, M44, located in the constellation Cancer.
What's fascinating here is that M44 is one of the closest open star clusters to Earth, sitting about 600 light-years away. It contains roughly 1,000 stars, all bound together by mutual gravity.
And the best part is you can actually see it with the naked eye if you are away from city lights. It will look like a faint glowing smudge.
Right.
But if you grab a pair of binoculars and point them at that smudge next to the moon, it is going to suddenly resolve into a handful of crushed diamonds scattered across black velvet. It is a beautiful, deeply tangible reminder of all these cosmic engines we are talking about today. It connects the abstract science to the physical reality above your head.
And that connection to physical reality is the perfect pivot point for our discussion. Because to truly understand the systems governing us, We cannot just look outward into the expansive macrocosm of the universe.
You have to look down.
We have to take that exact same analytical lens and turn it inward. We must look deep into our own human past, into the dirt beneath our feet, and deep into the microscopic blueprints of our own biology.
Let's start with the dirt beneath our feet. Because while we are mapping the skeletons of stars, archaeologists in central China have just unearthed something equally profound.
Yes, they have.
They have excavated a 5,000-year-old tomb belonging to the Dewenku culture. And based on the reporting, this isn't just a standard burial site. The team uncovered an absolutely staggering wealth of artifacts.
It's quite a haul.
We are talking about hundreds of items, intricate ceramics, beautifully carved jade ornaments, and highly specialized weaponry. The sheer volume and the pristine quality of these grave goods strongly suggest to researchers that they have found the tomb of a prehistoric king.
The discovery is monumental for anthropological history. For context, the Dewenku culture is a highly crucial piece of the puzzle regarding Neolithic China.
When was this exactly?
They existed roughly between 4100 and 2600 BC, primarily spread across what are now the Shandong, Anhui, Henan, and Jiangsu provinces.
Okay, so a very long time ago.
Very. But what makes a tomb like this so incredibly vital to modern archaeologists is not just the aesthetic beauty of a jade axe. It is what the presence of that jade axe tells us about the living, breathing society that buried him.
Right.
Burial practices, particularly from this era, serve as an unvarnished mirror for ancient social and political hierarchies.
Walk me through that logic. Is it just because they clearly spent an enormous amount of time, energy, and resources building the tomb?
It is specifically about the concept of surplus and the centralization of resources. Think about human history. In an egalitarian, nomadic, hunter-gatherer society, everyone is constantly working just to acquire enough calories to survive the week.
Just hunting and gathering.
Exactly. Because everyone is engaged in subsistence, wealth cannot easily accumulate, and therefore burials are generally uniform and simple. Nobody has the time to carve a ceremonial jade ornament.
Right, because if you stop hunting to carve a rock, you starve.
Exactly. But as societies begin to master agriculture, domesticating crops and livestock, they suddenly create surplus wealth. They grow more food than they need to immediately consume.
Okay, I see.
That surplus changes everything. It allows a society to feed people who do not farm. It allows for intense specialization. Suddenly you have a class of full-time artisans whose only job is to master the incredibly difficult, labor-intensive process of carving jade without modern metal tools.
Ah, right.
So when you unearth a single tomb packed with hundreds of these high-value, labor-intensive goods, it is undeniable proof that this single individual had the absolute power to command the labor, the time, and the surplus resources of thousands of other people.
So finding this much wealth in one place marks the exact historical pivot point where human society moved from communal survival to a rigid class system.
It marks the moment when social stratification, early statehood, and inherited wealth were rapidly coalescing. And the inclusion of specialized weaponry in the tomb is the dark, silent counterpart to that wealth.
Oh, so?
It indicates that this concentration of power at the top of the pyramid was likely established and maintained, at least in part, through organized martial force and violence.
So this 5,000-year-old king selfishly tried to take his immense wealth to the grave for the afterlife. And in doing so, he accidentally left us a perfectly preserved, petrified organizational chart of his entire civilization.
That's a great way to put it.
It is brilliant. But let's accelerate from mastering the archaeology of our deep past to how we are aggressively mastering the biology of our immediate future. And I have to admit, this next topic completely threw me when I read the research.
I don't blame you.
Biotechnologists in agricultural laboratories are currently actively genetically modifying chicken eggs to produce highly complex human pharmaceutical proteins.
It sounds like science fiction, but the science is very real and rapidly advancing. Researchers are essentially hijacking the natural biological manufacturing machinery of the chicken.
Hijacking the chicken.
Yeah. They're turning the bird into a living factory to manufacture life-saving drugs. Specifically, they are focused on complex therapeutic proteins, things like monoclonal antibodies and specialized enzymes, which are notoriously difficult, slow, and astronomically expensive to synthesize from scratch in a traditional laboratory setting.
Okay, I have to push back here. I need a massive reality check.
Sure.
Breakfast is becoming a bioreactor. How does this mechanically even work? I mean, Do I crack a genetically modified egg into a hot frying pan and instead of an over-easy breakfast, out comes a liquid dose of heart medication? And how do they possibly ensure this genetically modified material doesn't accidentally end up in my supermarket omelet? And honestly, what does this actually mean for the future of the pharmaceutical industry?
Let's break down the mechanics, because it is an incredibly elegant, if somewhat jarring, piece of biotechnology. Let's start with the how. The researchers use what's called a viral vector.
A viral vector.
You can think of a viral vector as a microscopic delivery truck. They take a virus, completely hollow out its harmful, infectious genetic material, and replace it with a specific human gene, the exact gene that contains the blueprint for the pharmaceutical protein they want to make.
Okay.
They then inject this viral vector into a newly laid, developing chicken embryo.
So the virus infects the chicken with the human blueprint.
Exactly. But they don't just put it anywhere. They specifically target the chicken's DNA associated with the oviduct, the reproductive organ where the egg white is formed.
Oh, wow.
Specifically, they target the genes that naturally code for ovalbumin, which is the primary naturally occurring protein in egg white. The integration is permanent.
So it's locked in.
Yes. Once that modified chicken hatches, matures, and begins its natural cycle of laying eggs, its reproductive system reads that newly inserted human gene right alongside its own genes. As it builds the egg, it actively produces the human pharmaceutical protein and deposits it directly into the egg white.
So the egg white inside the shell is literally saturated with human medicine.
Yes. The egg white becomes a highly concentrated suspension of the drug. Now, regarding your very valid concern about your breakfast,
Yes, please.
you do not need to worry about accidentally eating an antibody omelet.
Right.
These transgenic chickens are not free-range birds mingling with normal poultry on a farm destined for the local grocery store.
Okay, phew.
They are raised in highly secure, heavily regulated, biosecure, and sterile indoor agricultural facilities. Their entire life cycle is isolated.
Right. So completely separate supply chains.
Entirely. Once the eggs are laid, they're carefully collected, transported to a biochemical lab, and the egg white is heavily processed, filtered, and purified to extract only the targeted pharmaceutical protein, leaving all the actual egg material behind.
Okay, that makes me feel slightly better about my groceries. But it begs the massive question, why go through all this trouble? Why hack the reproductive system of a chicken? Why not just make the drugs in a lab like we always do?
2 words: cost and scalability. To understand the advantage, you have to understand what a monoclonal antibody is.
Okay.
It is not a simple chemical like aspirin that you can just mix up in a vat. It is a massive, highly complex, Y-shaped protein designed to bind to very specific targets in the body, like cancer cells or viruses.
Right, they're super targeted.
Currently, manufacturing these complex proteins requires massive, million-dollar stainless steel bioreactors, where genetically modified mammalian cells are painstakingly cultured in nutrient broths under incredibly strict, highly controlled conditions regarding temperature, oxygen, and sterility.
Which sounds expensive.
Very. If a single stray bacteria gets into the vat, the entire million-dollar batch is ruined. It is anomalily expensive, which is why antibody therapies often cost patients tens of thousands of dollars.
Ah, I see where this is going. The chicken does all of that work for free.
Precisely. A healthy hen naturally, effortlessly, produces several grams of highly complex protein in its eggs almost every single day. The bird is the bioreactor.
Wow.
It regulates its own temperature, it feeds itself, and the cost of chicken feed and basic housing is exponentially cheaper than maintaining a sterilized pharmaceutical laboratory.
Obviously.
If this process scales successfully, it points toward a radical democratization of medicine. The manufacturing of incredibly complex, life-saving drugs could become localized and decentralized.
That's incredible.
Imagine a small, secure facility in a developing nation that is suddenly able to produce critical antiviral antibodies for its population simply by managing a specialized flock of a few hundred chickens. It could drastically lower the barrier to access for vital therapeutics globally.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. We are literally rewriting the biological source code of a bird to bypass the bottleneck of multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical factories.
We are.
But it is fascinating that as we finally begin to master and manipulate our biological reality, we are simultaneously wrestling with and losing control of our digital creations.
Yes.
We are trying to control biology while our technology runs wild. Which brings us perfectly into the algorithmic reality that we are all currently living in. I want to look at the massive boom of generative artificial intelligence and the equally massive, somewhat desperate pushback against it.
The pace of development in generative AI has moved from a steady, predictable jog to an absolute breathless sprint. We are no longer talking about experimental novelties. We are witnessing major structural shifts in how human media and information are created, distributed, and consumed.
Right.
For instance, look at ByteDance, the Chinese parent company of the global phenomenon TikTok. They've just launched their new Dramina Seedance 2.0 AI video model. But they didn't just release it as a standalone research tool. They integrated it directly into CapCut.
And for anyone who doesn't know, CapCut is the massively popular, highly accessible video editing platform used by millions of creators every single day. This is a massive shift.
It's huge.
They are not putting this tool in the hands of Hollywood CGI studios. They're putting high-level generative video, the ability to conjure highly realistic video clips from thin air using just simple text prompts or a static photo, directly into the hands of teenagers making TikToks in their bedrooms.
The democratization of reality-bending technology.
Exactly. And it's not just visual. On the audio and ambient computing front, Google is aggressively expanding its capabilities. They are rolling out real-time, headphone-based language translation via their Gemini AI. Furthermore, they are launching Google Search Live globally.
Google Search Live is perhaps the most profound shift in how we interact with the digital world. You point your smartphone camera at an object, a building, or a textbook, and you have a fluid, real-time, spoken conversation with the AI about what the camera is seeing.
It's crazy.
You ask questions, it analyzes the visual feed instantaneously, and it answers you back in a natural human voice.
It is the death of the search bar.
Exactly. It represents the dissolution of the traditional user interface. We are rapidly moving away from the paradigm of deliberately typing discrete queries into a blank box on a screen and scrolling through blue links.
Right.
The AI is becoming an ambient, contextual companion that processes the physical world alongside us. The Gemini model is simultaneously ingesting live visual data, processing natural language, translating audio across multiple languages, preserving the original speaker's emotional tone and cadence, and generating logically sound responses instantaneously.
Just processing all of that at once.
From a computer science perspective, it is a staggering marvel of neural network processing.
But from a human perspective, it is also terrifying, right? Because if I can open CapCut and generate a photorealistic video of a politician doing something they never did, and if I can use an AI to speak to me in a perfectly cloned, emotionally resonant voice of my boss or my family member in real time, what constitutes reality anymore? How do we trust anything we don't physically touch?
And that profound anxiety is exactly why we are seeing a massive countermeasure arms race taking place. As the generation engines get stronger, the desperation to build detection engines grows.
Right.
For example, the French international media outlet France 24 recently conducted a rigorous, highly publicized test. They pitted 10 different state-of-the-art AI detection tools against a massive data set of imagery.
And what were they looking for?
Their goal was simple. They wanted to find a tool that could definitively, legally verify if an image was 100% human versus being generated or subtly altered by an AI. Concurrently, Wikipedia, one of the last bastions of human-curated knowledge, is actively updating its editorial guidelines. They're deploying editors and tools specifically designed to spot AI-generated phrasing and the excessive, unnatural formatting errors that are highly characteristic of large language models.
Let's talk about those detection tools for a second, because I want to know if they actually work.
That's the million-dollar question.
Because from where I sit, it feels like the tech industry has built the most incredible digital theme park in human history, but they completely forgot to install the brakes on the roller coasters before opening the gates. We built the engine of creation before we built the engine of verification.
It is undeniably the defining challenge of our era, maintaining visual and informational trust in a post-truth digital landscape. To understand if the tools work, you need an ELI 5 on how they function.
Okay, lay it on me.
AI detection tools do not possess a magical truth sensor. They rely on statistical heuristics. For text, they look for two main things: perplexity and burstiness.
Break those down for me.
Perplexity measures how predictable the choice of words is. Large language models like ChatGPT work by predicting the most statistically likely next word in a sequence.
So it's essentially just superpowered autocomplete.
Yes. Therefore, AI-generated text has very low perplexity. It is highly predictable and mathematically safe. Human writing, however, is deeply weird.
Cool.
We use odd metaphors, we break grammatical rules, we choose unusual synonyms, we have high perplexity.
Okay, and burstiness.
Burstiness refers to the variation in sentence length and structure. AI tends to write in a very steady, monotonous, rhythm medium sentence, medium sentence, medium sentence.
Right, it can be very dull.
Humans are bursty. We write a very long, complex run-on sentence, and then a short one, like that.
So the detector reads an article, sees that it's highly predictable and lacks rhythm, and flags it as AI. That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about images?
For images, detectors look for unnatural pixel artifacts. They look for lighting shadows that don't mathematically align with the light source. They look for the classic AI failure, points hands with 6 fingers, asymmetrical pupils, text on a sign that looks like alien hieroglyphics. But here is the fatal flaw in the entire detection industry. Generative models are fundamentally adversarial by nature.
Meaning they learn from their mistakes.
Exactly. The engineers building the AI generators use the detectors to train the generators.
Oh, wow.
Every time a detector figures out how to spot an AI image, the generator updates its neural network to remove that specific flaw. It is a perpetual, accelerating cat-and-mouse game.
So you can never really win.
Right. So the results from France 24's test were deeply concerning. They found that while these detection tools can easily flag the obvious low-quality fakes, they are hopelessly plagued by false positives and false negatives when facing high-end generation.
Yikes.
If a platform like Wikipedia relies solely on an algorithm to ban users for AI writing, they run the massive risk of banning brilliant human volunteers, particularly non-native English speakers, who simply happen to write in a highly structured, formal, low-perplexity tone.
Because they're writing carefully.
Exactly. We are stuck in a paradigm where the lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is still calibrating its detection software.
And the friction we're seeing isn't just technological, it is deeply corporate, and it is increasingly regulatory. Let's look at the chaos inside OpenAI, the creators of ChatGPT.
Let's do it.
They just completely abandoned a massive internal project. They had a side quest to build an erotic mode for their models, essentially allowing the AI to generate explicit adult content. But they just killed the project entirely. They realized the regulatory heat and the impending public relations nightmare simply wasn't worth the revenue.
What you are seeing with OpenAI is a fascinating corporate evolution. They are attempting to rapidly mature from a reckless, move fast and break things startup into a stable, globally trusted corporation.
Right.
Remember, they gained 100 million users in 2 months, back in 2022. With that unprecedented scale comes the unblinking, hostile eye of global regulators. When you are dealing with a technology that is prone to hallucinations, meaning the AI confidently invents facts and fabricates realities, producing adult content is an absolute legal minefield.
Because of deepfakes.
Yes, you are opening the door to the mass generation of non-consensual deepfake pornography. By abandoning the project, OpenAI is attempting to sanitize their image. They want to position themselves as a safe, universally acceptable enterprise tool that Fortune 500 companies can integrate without fear of scandal.
But even with that sanitization, the regulators and the courts are still swinging wild. Just look at the Pentagon. The Department of Defense previously tried to hit the AI firm Anthropic with sanctions, officially labeling them a supply chain risk.
Right.
They were actively trying to restrict Anthropic's ability to secure massive federal contracts. But just recently, U.S. Judge Alvin Hellerstein had to step in and issue a preliminary injunction, temporarily blocking those Trump-era sanctions. And simultaneously, we see David Sachs, who was appointed as the U.S. AI czar to wrangle all this, stepping down from the position to return to private investing. The regulatory landscape feels like a revolving door of total chaos.
The Anthropic case is a perfect encapsulation of the central tension paralyzing modern government, the conflict between national security paranoia and the desperate need for private sector innovation.
Explain that dynamic.
From the perspective of the Pentagon, they are terrified of integrating AI systems into critical defense infrastructure when the decision-making process of those AI models is an opaque black box. The military demands predictability, and LLMs are inherently unpredictable, hence the supply chain risk label.
Okay, that makes sense.
But from the perspective of the economy, aggressively blocking a major multi-billion-dollar American AI firm from federal work risks artificially stunting the industry and putting the U.S. significantly behind geopolitical rivals like China in the global AI race.
Right, you can't just hit pause while the rest of the world keeps coding.
Exactly. David Sachs leaving his post so quickly highlights the sheer impossibility of governing this space. The private tech sector is moving at the speed of light, iterating models weekly, while the government moves at the glacial speed of congressional legislation and judicial review.
And while we talk about all this software, all these algorithms floating in the cloud, we need to shatter that metaphor. The cloud is not a fluffy white thing in the sky. The cloud is physical.
Highly physical.
It is millions of blinking, whining servers stacked in massive, windowless concrete warehouses. And those servers are incredibly voraciously thirsty for electricity.
Yes, they are.
This brings us to a really fascinating political alliance. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley, two lawmakers who reside on opposite ends of the political spectrum and rarely agree on anything, are teaming up. They are formally demanding that the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, force these massive data centers to publicly report their electricity consumption.
This raises an important question for our society. Exactly how much physical energy, environmental degradation, and mental bandwidth are we willing to sacrifice at the altar of digital convenience?
It's a scary thought.
The computational power required to train a foundational model like Gemini and the power required to run millions of inference requests every minute is staggering. We are talking about facilities that draw as much power as a medium-sized city.
Wow.
Furthermore, they require millions of gallons of fresh water to cool the servers. This explosive growth is severely straining local power grids, particularly in places like Northern Virginia. It is driving up utility costs for average households who happen to live near these data centers, and it is threatening to derail state-level climate goals.
So they just want to know the actual numbers.
Yes. Senators Warren and Hawley are pushing for this baseline transparency because it is a fundamental rule of governance. You cannot regulate, tax, or mitigate the environmental impact of something if you don't even have the data on its baseline consumption.
And the toll isn't just measured in megawatts in water, the toll is measured in our own psychology. We are seeing major legal shifts regarding the human cost of the algorithm.
Yes, this is huge.
A California jury just handed down a landmark verdict. They ordered Meta and Google to pay $6 million in damages to a 20-year-old woman named Kaylee. Her legal team successfully argued in court that these massive tech conglomerates deliberately and maliciously designed their algorithms specifically to addict her when she was a vulnerable minor. And if you look across the Atlantic, the UK government is taking preventative action. They have officially issued sweeping new public health advice stating that children under the age of 5 should be restricted to a maximum of 1 hour of screen time daily.
The Kaylee verdict in California is a true watershed moment in tech law. For the past decade, social media companies have hidden behind the defense that they are merely neutral platforms hosting third-party content.
Just the messenger, right?
Exactly. But this verdict legally acknowledges that the design architecture of the platform itself, features like the inference scroll, algorithmic content recommendation, and variable reward notifications, are not neutral. They are highly engineered behavioral hooks.
Designed to keep you scrolling.
Yes. They're designed using the exact same psychological principles as casino slot machines. Specifically, the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement to maximize dopamine hits and drive compulsive engagement.
That's terrifying when you apply it to a teenager.
It is. The $6 million payout is financially meaningless to a trillion-dollar company like Meta, but it sets a devastating legal precedent. It cracks the armor. It opens the floodgates for massive class action liability regarding the tangible mental health impacts of digital products on minors.
And the UK guidance.
The UK guidance on under 5s is the logical public health response to this exact realization. We are finally beginning to treat unregulated algorithmic engagement with the same severe regulatory caution that we apply to refined sugar, alcohol, or tobacco.
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the physical reality of what we just discussed. We are burning vast, unprecedented amounts of physical electricity to power massive concrete data centers, just so those servers can generate AI videos of things that never happened and power addictive infinite scrolls that damage our children's psychology.
Put like that, it sounds pretty grim.
Right. But here is where the story pivots. Because the energy needed to power those tech data centers is absolutely nothing compared to the massive physical energy crisis currently brewing in the real world. Let's look at the physical choke points of our global economy.
To understand the vulnerability of the global economy, you must look at a map, specifically at the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, paint a picture for us.
For those unfamiliar with the geography, the Strait of Hormuz is a remarkably narrow stretch of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and eventually the open ocean. To call it a bottleneck is an understatement.
How narrow is it?
At its absolute narrowest point, the strait is only 21 miles wide. And because the waters are shallow and full of islands like the Musandam Peninsula, the designated deep-water shipping lanes for massive supertankers are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
Wow, that's incredibly tight.
Yet despite this claustrophobic geography, roughly 20% of the entire world's total oil consumption and a massive percentage of global liquefied natural gas must pass through this tiny gap every single day. It is the jugular vein of the industrialized world.
And right now, Iran has essentially walked up to that jugular vein and applied a tourniquet. They have set up a literal toll booth in the middle of international waters.
Yes, they have.
They are demanding a ransom of $2 million per vessel to allow them to pass through safely. And because shipping companies are terrified of having their multi-million-dollar vessels seized or sunk, there are currently 2,000 massive cargo ships and oil tankers stranded, dropping anchor, waiting, and afraid to cross.
This is a massive crisis.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has deployed fast attack boats and is physically boarding and screening these vessels. They are literally holding the physical global economy hostage.
The sheer audacity of this move is deeply rooted in geography and the mechanics of asymmetric warfare. Legally, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLS, all international vessels have the absolute right of transit passage through international straits.
So what they're doing is totally illegal.
You cannot legally close it or tax it. Iran's toll system is a flagrant, direct violation of international maritime law. But Iran is utilizing the IRGC to enforce it because they are deliberately testing the threshold of Western response.
Calling our bluff.
They know that to end the blockade, the West would have to initiate a full-scale, kinetic military clearing of the strait.
Yeah.
That would instantly ignite a massive regional war in the Middle East, which would spike global oil prices to apocalyptic levels, crippling the Western economies they are targeting.
Right.
Iran is betting that the West's fear of inflation is stronger than their commitment to freedom of navigation.
But not everyone is paralyzed by that fear. Israel is absolutely not sitting on its hands. According to the reporting, Israel claims to have successfully assassinated the top Iranian naval commander who was directly overseeing the logistics of this exact maritime blockade.
That's a major development.
And simultaneously, Israel is severely tightening domestic media restrictions on their own war coverage, which, historically, is a glaring signal of a heightened state of operational security in preparation for larger military moves. Things are escalating incredibly fast.
The assassination of a top IRGC naval commander is a highly provocative kinetic strike. It is designed to decapitate the leadership and disrupt the command and control logistics of the IRGC's fast attack boat swarm operations in the strait.
Okay.
It is a massively calculated risk by Israeli intelligence. They are attempting to surgically break the chokehold on the shipping lanes by eliminating the architects of the blockade, hoping to do so without triggering the massive, multi-front ballistic missile war that everyone fears.
That is a very thin tightrope to walk.
The margin for error in this strategy is razor thin.
And what exactly is the United States, the traditional guarantor of global maritime security, doing about this?
Well, President Donald Trump has officially extended a pause on U.S. military strikes against Iranian energy and nuclear sites.
Yes.
He gave Tehran a 10-day extension, pushing the deadline for military action to April 6, stating that he wants to allow time for diplomatic negotiations. He publicly told the press that the back-channel talks are going very well.
Right.
But the moment he said that, Iran released a fiery public statement, absolutely rejecting his framing, calling his words false statements, and explicitly stating that the Islamic Republic will not capitulate to American pressure.
This is the anatomy of a classic diplomatic pressure cooker. The temporary pause on military strikes is the carrot being offered by Washington. It provides Iran a face-saving window to quietly de-escalate the situation and perhaps secure some desperately needed economic sanctions relief through back channels.
Have we seen any sign of that working? We actually saw a glimmer of this recently when Iran abruptly allowed 10 Pakistani-flagged oil tankers to pass through the strait without paying the toll, framing it as a diplomatic gift to the U.S. But public diplomacy and private geopolitical reality are almost always divergent.
Yeah, the public posturing is totally different.
Iran's fierce public rejection of Trump's optimism is necessary for the regime to maintain its domestic image of unyielding strength and defiance against Western imperialism. Conversely, Trump's assertion that talks are going very well is likely a strategic attempt to project control and calm the highly volatile global oil markets, which absolutely despise uncertainty and will spike prices at the mere rumor of war.
But the U.S. response is also severely hampered by its own internal domestic chaos. Right now, the United States government is facing a massive, paralyzing shutdown specifically centered over funding for the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS.
And it's causing real problems.
This isn't just politicians arguing on television. This has brutal, direct consequences on the ground. Because the DHS is unfunded, the Transportation Security Administration is breaking down. 500 TSA agents have flat out quit.
Wow.
50,000 agents are being forced to work their shifts without receiving a paycheck. And because major airports are rapidly descending into chaotic logistical bottlenecks, the administration has taken the extreme step of deploying immigration and customs enforcement ICE agents to physically check passenger IDs at airport security lines.
It's a drastic measure.
President Trump has issued an executive order demanding immediate back pay for the TSA to stop the bleeding, but the structural legislative gridlock in Congress remains completely unresolved.
To truly understand this impasse without falling into partisan bickering, we have to look impartially at the fundamentally divergent political philosophies that are driving this gridlock.
Let's hear it.
From the conservative perspective, border enforcement and immigration control are viewed as the absolute paramount national security issues facing the republic. The fundamental view is that a sovereign nation cannot exist without strictly securing its physical borders.
Okay.
Therefore, utilizing the extreme leverage of withholding a massive federal funding bill is seen as a legitimate, necessary, and constitutional tool to force the opposition's hand and secure vital policy changes regarding immigration enforcement. From this viewpoint, the temporary disruption of airports is an unfortunate but necessary price to pay, because failing to leverage this funding means critical, existential security vulnerabilities will remain permanently unaddressed.
Okay, I understand the philosophy of leverage, but I have to point out the reality of the execution here. From the liberal perspective, this isn't just a tough negotiating tactic. It is actively destructive to the apparatus of the state.
Yes, that's the counterargument.
They argue that shutting down the government and holding the mortgages and grocery money of 50,000 federal workers hostage is a reckless tactic that inflicts immense pain on working-class American families. Furthermore, look at the operational hazard. Deploying ICE agents to airports is a massive red flag.
It's certainly unprecedented.
ICE agents are highly trained for targeted immigration enforcement raids, not the mundane, high-volume logistics of commercial aviation security. From the liberal view, deploying them blurs dangerous jurisdictional lines, creates an environment of fear and intimidation for immigrant communities traveling domestically, and crucially, it doesn't even solve the logistical backlog of the TSA. The liberal priority here is diplomatic de-escalation, the protection of immigrant rights, and ensuring the stable baseline functioning of essential federal agencies without using workers as pawns.
That is a very fair assessment of the operational reality.
Yeah.
Both political sides are acting on deeply held, fundamental convictions about what constitutes national stability and moral governance.
Right.
But regardless of the philosophy, the practical logistical fallout on the ground is undeniable and dangerous. When you force 50,000 TSA agents to work high-stress security jobs without pay, morale plummets, focus wanes, and the statistical probability of a catastrophic security failure inevitably rises. Deploying ICE agents to perform basic ID checks is a desperate stopgap measure that starkly highlights the immense strain being placed on the federal apparatus.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this deep dive right now? Because it is incredibly easy to sit in your living room and think that a narrow strait in the Middle East or a bitter political fight over DHS funding in Washington, D.C. are abstract, distant concepts that don't affect your daily life.
But they absolutely do.
The global economic ripple effect is immediate, brutal, and it hits your wallet directly. Because of the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, Brent crude oil has spiked to over $110 a barrel. Consequently, the S&P 500 is falling as investors panic.
It's a domino effect.
If we look globally, the situation in Africa is dire. Nations are literally diluting their national petrol supplies with other chemical additives just to make the fuel stretch, and they are instituting rolling blackouts, rationing grid power to citizens. In the UK, the price of petrol at the pump has surged past 150 pence a litre, crushing household budgets.
And in the U.S.?
In the U.S., the cost of commercial airline flights is skyrocketing due to jet fuel costs. And crucially, fertilizer prices are spiking, which is driving up the cost of food, all while central banks keep mortgage rates punishingly high.
The causality of this economic pain is incredibly direct. It traces back to the physical realities of our supply chains. When the IRGC chokes the Strait of Hormuz, the total global supply of available oil dramatically shrinks overnight. When supply shrinks while demand remains constant, prices violently rise. Basic economics. And oil is the lifeblood of the global economy. Transporting anything across the planet, whether it is food, consumer electronics, or construction materials, suddenly becomes vastly more expensive. Airline fuel costs jump, so carriers pass that cost directly to the consumer, spiking ticket prices.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the most insidious effect is on agriculture. Modern, high-yield agriculture relies absolutely heavily on petrochemicals to produce the nitrogen-based fertilizers required to grow crops at scale, often via the Haber-Bosch process, which requires immense amounts of natural gas.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
When energy prices spike, fertilizer becomes prohibitively expensive. This means the cost for a farmer to grow a bushel of wheat rises, which means the bakery pays more for flour, which means you get hit with inflation at the grocery store checkout. And to combat this pervasive inflation, central banks are forced to maintain high interest rates to cool the economy, which makes it impossible for the average person to afford a mortgage on a house.
It's just wild to me. A literal traffic jam of oil tankers sitting in the Persian Gulf, orchestrated by men in fast attack boats, somehow mathematically dictates that my local grocery run costs 30% more, and I can't afford to buy a house in my own neighborhood.
It's the butterfly effect.
It is the butterfly effect, but the butterfly is a 2 million barrel oil tanker.
Yes. It perfectly illustrates how hyper-connected and deeply fragile our just-in-time global supply chains truly are. There is absolutely no such thing as an isolated, localized geopolitical event anymore. The shockwaves travel through the economic medium instantly.
And this desperate scramble for physical resources, this global pressure cooker of crushing inflation and energy insecurity, is forcing nations to make some incredibly strange pragmatic alliances. And it's also forcing massive corporations to face unprecedented legal challenges. We are looking at a brand new geopolitical chessboard.
The traditional ideological alliances of the post-Cold War era are rapidly fracturing. In their place, we are seeing new, highly pragmatic transactional partnerships forming, based entirely on immediate material and military needs.
Give us an example.
For instance, look at the recent diplomatic meeting where Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko presented a physical firearm as a gift to North Korea's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un.
Which, on the surface, seems like such a bizarrely specific, almost mafia-esque diplomatic gift. Why not a painting or a cultural artifact?
Because the gift is deeply symbolic of the underground economy they are operating. Belarus is heavily, inextricably allied with Russia. North Korea is arguably the most heavily sanctioned, isolated nation on Earth. Yet North Korea possesses massive legacy stockpiles of Soviet-era artillery shells and munitions, specifically the 152mm shells that Russia desperately needs to sustain its artillery-heavy warfare.
So it's a signal.
The highly publicized gift of a gun is a visible, undeniable signal of a deepening military, industrial, and strategic partnership among nations that view themselves in direct existential opposition to Western hegemony and the U.S. dollar. They are actively building an alternative, sanction-proof military bloc.
And on the complete other side of the global conflict, you have Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visiting Saudi Arabia. He isn't there asking for humanitarian aid. He is there signing a strategic air defense deal and actively offering Ukraine's incredibly hard-won, bleeding-edge expertise in drone warfare to the Saudis. Meanwhile, the Russian government is vehemently denying Western intelligence reports that they are sending their own drone technology to Iran.
The Ukrainian move is brilliant geopolitics. Over the last 3 years, drone warfare has completely, irreversibly rewritten military doctrine. Ukraine has developed immense, unparalleled operational knowledge in deploying cheap asymmetric drone swarms to systematically dismantle highly expensive conventional military assets. By offering this specialized expertise to Saudi Arabia, a nation constantly dealing with drone threats to its oil infrastructure from Houthi rebels, Ukraine is building a vital strategic relationship with a major global energy power. They are likely seeking financial backing or diplomatic leverage in return.
And what about Russia denying sending drones to Iran?
Regarding Russia's denial of sending drones to Iran, despite overwhelming visual evidence to the contrary, this is standard diplomatic obfuscation. It is a calculated lie that allows both Moscow and Tehran to maintain a thin veneer of international deniability while quietly deepening their massive military-industrial cooperation.
And Russia isn't just consolidating power in Eastern Europe or the Middle East, they are actively testing the waters right in America's backyard. Right now, a Russian oil tanker, officially claiming to carry humanitarian aid, is currently nearing the coast of Cuba. It is steaming directly toward the island, openly testing the decades-old U.S. economic blockade.
It's a bold move.
And at the exact same time this is happening, the Mexican Navy is desperately conducting search operations for 2 lost humanitarian aid ships that were also bound for Havana. It feels like the Caribbean Sea is suddenly a major geopolitical hotspot again.
The Russian tanker is a deliberate, highly calculated probing of American resolve. By sending a massive vessel right to the edge of Cuban territorial waters, Russia is forcing the United States government into a lose-lose choice.
How so?
If the U.S. Navy enforces the embargo and aggressively intercepts a ship claiming to carry medicine and food, it looks terrible optically on the world stage, and it risks a direct, potentially catastrophic naval confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. But if the U.S. lets the tanker pass unhindered, it projects weakness, validates the Russian narrative that the U.S. is a paper tiger, and proves that the blockade is porous.
So they're just daring us to act.
It is a precise stress test of U.S. foreign policy, executed precisely while Washington is hopelessly distracted by the Middle East crisis and paralyzed by its own domestic government shutdowns.
And speaking of paralyzed governments, let's look at South America. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is currently sitting inside a federal courtroom in New York. He is physically being held in a high-security facility described as a jail, inside a jail in Brooklyn, facing massive federal narco-terrorism charges.
Right.
U.S. prosecutors are aggressively arguing that he systematically plundered the wealth of the Venezuelan state for decades. But the trial is currently bogged down because Maduro's defense team is arguing they can't even get paid because the U.S. government froze all of Venezuela's international funds.
It's a legal mess.
Judge Alvin Hellerstein is refusing to dismiss the case over these legal fees. But the truly wild, paradoxical part is this. Even with the dictator physically sitting in a Brooklyn jail cell, his entire state apparatus back in Caracas remains firmly in place and completely operational.
That is the enduring paradox of attempting regime decapitation. Simply removing the figurehead at the top does not automatically dismantle the deep state beneath him. It doesn't dissolve the military loyalists who benefit from the corruption, and it doesn't erase the entrenched institutional bureaucracy that actually executes the daily levers of power.
It just keeps running.
The legal maneuvering happening in that New York courtroom, the surreal argument over whether frozen, allegedly plundered sovereign state funds can legally be released to pay top-tier American defense attorneys for a criminal trial, is fascinating, uncharted legal territory. But it doesn't immediately change the grim reality on the ground for the average citizen in Caracas. The institutional structures of oppression remain entirely intact.
So we're witnessing these massive, seemingly immovable power struggles happening on a state level. But there's also a massive, fascinating pushback happening from the absolute grassroots level, specifically regarding environmental justice and climate accountability.
Yes, the EACOP case.
Right now, a group of local Ugandan farmers is using a courtroom in Britain to sue the massive developers of the EACOP, the East African crude oil pipeline. The primary target of the lawsuit is the French multinational energy giant, Total Energies. And the fascinating twist is that the farmers are fighting the case by citing Uganda's own National Environment Act, but they are doing it in London.
This represents a remarkable, highly aggressive legal strategy with potentially massive global implications. The EACOP is a proposed $5.6 billion infrastructure project designed to transport crude oil. Over its lifetime, it will generate tens of millions of tons of greenhouse gases.
Right.
Local farmers in Uganda and Tanzania, many of whom have faced forced displacement or loss of arable land due to the construction, are arguing that the pipeline utterly destroys their livelihoods and fundamentally violates their constitutional right to a clean, healthy environment.
But I need you to explain the geography of the lawsuit here. Why are Ugandan farmers suing a French company in a British court over a pipeline located in East Africa?
The linchpin of this strategy is corporate structure. ECOP Ltd., the specific operating company managing the pipeline for Total Energies, happens to be legally registered and headquartered in London.
Ah, I see.
The farmers are represented by a highly specialized British law firm. They are aggressively leveraging a complex legal concept known as extraterritorial jurisdiction. They are arguing that multinational corporations headquartered in the wealthy global north can and must be held legally liable in their own domestic home courts for the environmental devastation and human rights abuses committed by their subsidiaries operating in the Global South.
That's a huge shift if it works.
If the British court agrees to fully hear this case and ultimately rules in favor of the farmers, it sets a chilling, industry-altering precedent for every single multinational fossil fuel and mining company on Earth. It means they will no longer be able to hide behind the weaker, easily manipulated regulatory enforcement of the developing nations where they extract resources. They will be dragged into courts in London, Paris, or New York and held to the highest legal standard.
It is a brilliant, desperate legal hack. They are taking the complex corporate shell structure created by the Global North to avoid taxes and weaponizing it against the corporations to force accountability.
Exactly.
But as we spend this entire hour talking about these vast, sweeping global systems, the geopolitics of pipelines, the architecture of AI algorithms, the theater of international courts, we have to remember that ultimately, all of this massive machinery trickles down and crushes or elevates individual human lives. It all eventually comes down to the microscopic level of human dignity, ethics, and culture. Let's examine the human element.
The macro always inevitably impacts the micro. We just saw a deeply emotional, legally complex, and highly divisive ruling handed down from the European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR. They ruled definitively in favor of a 25-year-old Spanish woman named Noelia Castillo.
It's a tough story.
She fought an agonizing, bitter legal battle, not against a corporation, but against her own father, to legally secure the right to undergo medical euthanasia.
It is such a heartbreaking, complex situation to read about. Noelia suffered from severe treatment-resistant clinical depression, which was compounded by physical paralysis following a tragic incident. Her father, acting out of a desperate, understandable parental love, fought through every level of the legal system to keep her alive, arguing she was not in a state of mind to make the choice. But the High Court ultimately sided with her fundamental right to end her life.
It forces us to confront perhaps the most profound ethical tension existing in modern secular society. On one side of the scale, you have the deeply held principle of absolute individual autonomy, the philosophical belief that an individual of sound mind possesses the ultimate sovereign right to determine the fate of their own physical body, which fundamentally includes the right to seek medical assistance to avoid prolonged, unbearable physical or psychological suffering. On the other side of the scale, you have the perspective that society and the medical establishment has a fundamental overriding moral responsibility to protect human life at all costs, to offer relentless hope, and to heal the vulnerable, rather than facilitating their death.
Right, and if you look at the critics of the ruling quoted in the reporting, they were arguing forcefully that facilitating euthanasia specifically for psychiatric conditions like clinical depression represents a catastrophic societal failure. They argue that by allowing this, society is choosing the grim efficiency of death over the incredibly difficult, highly expensive, long-term investment required to truly support and heal someone trapped in profound psychological distress.
Precisely. It strips away the legal jargon and asks us, as a society, what compassion truly looks like in practice. Is true compassion legally granting someone the final release they are begging for? Or is true compassion the refusal to give up on them, forcing them to endure, even when they have completely given up on themselves?
It's an impossible question.
The ECHR's ruling legally prioritizes the autonomy of the individual, but it leaves behind a deeply fractured, unresolved cultural conversation about how we assign value to life and how utterly unequipped our medical systems are to care for the invisible, intractable wounds of the human mind.
And when we talk about invisible wounds and fractured cultural conversations, there is a massive reckoning happening right now in the French jazz scene. The cultural impact of the Me Too movement is still ongoing and evolving. Female musicians in France are finally publicly breaking down a long-standing, deeply entrenched culture of silence regarding systemic sexism, harassment, and abuse within the industry.
If we connect this to the bigger picture we have been discussing today, it perfectly mirrors the structural dynamics of power we've seen in every other topic.
Absolutely.
The French jazz scene, much like many insular artistic or academic communities, has operated for decades on a highly informal, opaque power structure. You have a small handful of male gatekeepers who completely control access to the lifeblood of a musician's career. They control the gig bookings, the lucrative recording contracts, and the coveted slots at major festivals. When power is that highly concentrated, and the decision-making process is entirely opaque and unregulated, abuse flourishes in the dark.
That's exactly it. It is about uncovering the things that have been deliberately hidden in the dark. That is the fundamental through line of this entire deep dive today.
It is.
Whether it is an archaeologist carefully digging up a 5,000-year-old Davenku tomb to finally reveal the hidden violent hierarchies of an ancient king, or an astronomer looking at the hidden magnetic skeleton of a supernova using X-ray polarization, or us two senators trying to force transparency to uncover the hidden massive electricity costs of the AI algorithms that are quietly rewriting our children's attention spans. It is all fundamentally about bringing the invisible mechanisms of power and causality into the light.
Because the reality is, you cannot change, you cannot regulate, and you certainly cannot survive a system that you cannot clearly see.
Well said.
That is why understanding the intricate mechanics of these events, understanding why Iran chooses a toll booth strategy instead of an outright war, understanding exactly how a genetic modification turns a chicken egg into a localized pharmaceutical factory, understanding why a British court might actually have the power to judge a Ugandan pipeline, is the only viable way to navigate the modern world. You, the listener, have to cultivate the discipline to look past the surface of the clock face and demand to see the gears.
Which brings us to the end of our incredibly long, winding journey today. We have gone from the launch pad of the Artemis II mission preparing to leave Earth to the intense legal battlegrounds of London and New York, navigating through the dangerously narrow, heavily armed shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, all the way down into the microscopic DNA of a chicken egg.
To you, the learner who stayed with us for this entire deep dive, being well-informed, isn't just about memorizing the trivia of today's news cycle so you can sound smart at a dinner party. It is about deeply understanding the intricate, often terrifying web of causality that connects all of these events.
Yeah.
The world is not a random series of isolated headlines. It is a single, breathing, highly reactive ecosystem.
And as always, we promise to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to rattle around in your brain as you go about the rest of your day.
I want you to think about the glaring juxtaposition of our species' capabilities versus our enduring vulnerabilities. If humanity possesses the absolute staggering brilliance to genetically program the reproductive system of a bird to cure a human disease, well, if we can build an artificial intelligence neural network that can translate a foreign language flawlessly in real time, right into your ear, and if we are currently building the rockets that will allow humans to permanently inhabit the moon, why do we still completely rely on a single, highly vulnerable 21-mile stretch of water in the Middle East to keep our entire global economy afloat? Are our technological advancements vastly outpacing our geopolitical and physical realities? We are literally building starships, but we are still fighting over toll booths in the desert.
That is the ultimate paradox we live in. We are gods with smartphones, but we are still held hostage by geography and human nature. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking at the gears, keep demanding to know how things work, and don't let anyone tell you the muddy waters of the world can't be cleared. We will see you next time.
For enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate. So imagine waking up tomorrow and finding a literal physical toll booth suddenly erected in the middle of the ocean.
Right, a very expensive toll booth.
Exactly. One that charges a massive container ship $2 million just to sail past. It sounds completely absurd, but that is exactly what we are seeing right now in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, and because of that single geographic choke point, we basically have an unprecedented global crisis on our hands. I mean, over 2,000 vessels are stranded right now.
Yeah. Global oil prices have violently surged past $105 a barrel, and major equity markets are feeling the shockwave, with the S&P 500 sliding right into correction territory and the Dow dropping over 400 points just today alone.
And it's not just a localized issue for the West either. We are looking at a planetary ripple effect that is fundamentally reshaping the daily realities of people from, Nairobi to London.
Precisely. Which brings us to the core disagreement we are tackling today. Does this devastating global economic fallout prove that the U.S.-led security order is collapsing, essentially giving way to a highly transactional multipolar world? Or does this intense shared vulnerability reinforce the absolute indispensability of U.S. hegemony to prevent global stagflation and chaos?
Right. The classic question of our era.
Exactly. And I take the position that the severe pain rippling across the planet right now proves that the global economy remains entirely dependent on American deterrence and leadership. Without it, the system simply breaks. You, however, contend that this crisis is the ultimate proof of a definitive shift, that we are already living in a multipolar reality where regional actors are successfully bypassing Washington and dictating their own terms.
That is exactly where we split. I don't look at this crisis and see a world crying out for American leadership. I see an autopsy of the old U.S.-led order.
Well, let me lay out why I think the opposite is true. This crisis highlights in incredibly painful detail why the U.S.-led global order is a necessity, not a luxury. We are witnessing severe economic trauma across multiple continents.
Oh, the pain is real. Absolutely.
Right. I mean, in the UK, everyday consumers are seeing petrol prices hit 150 pence a liter for the first time in nearly 2 years. In various African nations, governments are having to dilute commercial petrol and implement rolling power blackouts just to keep basic infrastructure running.
Yeah.
So the vulnerability here proves a fundamental truth. Modern planetary trade cannot function without a singular, ultimate guarantor of maritime security. And we are seeing the U.S. step into that role right now.
Are we, though?
Yes, Washington is managing this crisis through a highly calibrated mix of force and diplomacy. Look at the strategic 10-day pause on U.S. strikes against Iranian energy sites. They're using military restraint as a direct diplomatic lever. Simultaneously, we are seeing the Witkoff 15-point peace proposal being floated.
The regional integration plan.
Exactly. For those unfamiliar, this is an extensive diplomatic framework designed to offer regional economic integration in exchange for the demilitarization of these maritime choke points. Nobody else on the planet has the leverage to broker that kind of deal. Without the American umbrella, these global value chains simply snap.
See, I look at those exact same events and I draw the complete opposite conclusion. The international system is already reorganizing itself, completely outside of Washington's purview.
How so?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is actively and brazenly defying UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is basically the legal bedrock for global freedom of navigation. They have erected this $2 million toll booth. And how is the rest of the world reacting?
They're panicking.
But they aren't waiting for the U.S. Navy to save them. They are adapting to a post-U.S. reality. India is actively discussing the resumption of direct LNG, liquefied natural gas sales from Russia, and has doubled its Russian crude imports to the tune of $44 billion.
Right, bypassing the sanctions.
Entirely bypassing Western sanctions. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, China is threatening devastating trade reprisals against Mexico over Mexico's new 50% import duties on Asian goods. Beijing isn't taking this to the WTO in Geneva, and they certainly aren't looking to Washington to mediate.
They're doing it bilaterally.
Exactly. Nation to nation. These actions demonstrate the birth of a decentralized, highly transactional world. The old mechanisms of U.S. financial and military threats simply do not dictate global behavior the way they did a decade ago.
Okay, let's drill down into that toll booth concept for a second, because the logistics of this are fascinating, but also incredibly revealing about U.S. military deterrence. We have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, proactively imposing this transit fee. But I think arguing that the U.S. is no longer dictating behavior misses the reality of the military posture shaping that battlefield right now.
Wait, I have to jump in here. Is the U.S. actually shaping that battlefield? Because from a market perspective, the U.S. appears entirely paralyzed.
Paralyzed?
Yes. You have Donald Trump publicly berating NATO allies for their inaction in securing the strait. You have financial analysts on Wall Street literally creating a joke metric called the TACO Index, which stands for Trump always chickens out, to track American hesitance and, price that geopolitical risk into the markets.
Oh, Wall Street is always going to have its cynical metrics.
But the Gulf Arab states are practically screaming for the U.S. to forcefully degrade Iran's military capabilities because a mere visual presence of the U.S. navies is no longer deterring anyone. The IRGC isn't hiding in the shadows. They are formalizing state-sponsored economic warfare.
I get the cynicism, I really do. But deterrence isn't just about parking an aircraft carrier in a Gulf and hoping everyone gets scared.
It's about the highly calibrated application of force. Look at Israel's recent targeted killing of the Iranian naval commander, who was personally overseeing this blockade.
Right.
That was a direct, kinetic message, fully backed by Western intelligence, to reopen the strait. And that 10-day pause on strikes you just call paralysis, that's a classic, calculated diplomatic lever. You pause the kinetic strike to force the adversary to the negotiating table.
But that assumes the adversary actually fears the strike enough to fundamentally alter their core strategic objectives. Iranian leadership has explicitly stated they view the prospect of war as something they have already factored in. I mean, they are institutionalizing this toll booth. They are reportedly considering legislation to codify these transit tolls in their parliament.
Which is wild to think about.
Exactly. That is not the behavior of a nation being deterred by a 10-day pause. Let me ask you this. How does a sanctioned entity even process a $2 million toll? They can't use the regular international banking system.
Exactly, which highlights how illegitimate the whole operation is.
Illegitimate, maybe, but highly functional. They are using shadow banking networks, local currency swaps, and even demanding physical transfers of crude oil off the books as payment. They are building a parallel financial infrastructure right in front of us. It sounds like a nation establishing a permanent new baseline of sovereignty over a global choke point, regardless of what the U.S. Navy is doing 50 miles away.
Let me offer a different way to visualize this. We used to think of the global economy as this natural, autonomous thing, like a nervous system or a global circulatory system, right?
Sure.
But it's actually more like a massive planetary data server. The Strait of Hormuz isn't a heart. It is a primary fiber optic cable for the global economy. Right now, Iran has installed a rogue firewall that is lagging the entire system.
Okay, I follow.
But the network still fundamentally relies on the main administrators, the U.S. and its allies, to clear the malware. If U.S. deterrence is truly dead, why is Iran still engaging in back-channel negotiations? We just saw reports that Iran allowed 10 Pakistani-flagged oil tankers through the strait completely toll-free as a quote-unquote gift to show seriousness to the U.S. in these ongoing talks. You don't offer diplomatic gifts to a hegemon if you believe their order is defunct.
I look at those 10 Pakistani ships a bit differently. Have you considered that allowing those specific vessels through is actually a demonstration of Iranian hegemony over the strait, not American?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a flex. Iran is showing Washington we control the valve. We decide who pays the toll, who gets a pass, and who gets block. They are proving they own the real estate. And let's look at the economic fallout from this rogue firewall you mentioned, because it is fundamentally altering the economic DNA of the planet.
Well, let's talk about that economic fallout, because I actually think it proves my central point. We have Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev out there warning that oil could reach $200 a barrel.
Which would be catastrophic.
Exactly. If that happens, we are staring at the very real mathematical possibility of a rapid European deindustrialization. And it goes beyond energy. The EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is flashing massive red warning signs right now about fertilizer supply chains.
And that, right there, is the crucial mechanism people overlook.
Right. Walk us through that. Why does a blockade in the Middle East threaten food security in Africa or South America?
Because modern agriculture is entirely dependent on nitrogen fertilizers, and nitrogen fertilizer is heavily reliant on ammonia.
Right, the Haber-Bosch process.
Exactly, which creates that ammonia and requires massive amounts of natural gas. When a choke point like Hormuz gets restricted, global natural gas prices spike violently.
And then what happens?
When natural gas spikes, fertilizer plants just shut down. It's simply too expensive to operate. Without fertilizer, global crop yields plummet. So a geopolitical stunt in the Persian Gulf literally dictates the price of a loaf of bread in Buenos Aires or Nairobi.
Exactly. And that intense, shared planetary vulnerability proves that the world must unite under U.S. leadership to stabilize these markets. You cannot have a localized, quote-unquote, multipolar solution to a $200 barrel of oil or a global famine. It requires a unified, U.S.-backed maritime and diplomatic intervention to forcibly keep the peace.
I agree that the economic pain is severe, but the reaction of the global community to that pain is what you need to look at. These economic shockwaves are not forcing nations to scurry back under the U.S. security umbrella. it is accelerating their decoupling from it.
I don't see it that way.
Well, nations are looking at that exact fertilizer mechanism and realizing that reliance on a US-led dollar-dominated system makes them incredibly vulnerable. Vulnerable to both the geographic choke points and US sanctions.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Because if we're talking about decoupling, you brought up India earlier, buying $44 billion in Russian crude. How exactly are they doing that? If the U.S. largely controls the SWIFT banking system and the dollar is the reserve currency, how is a $44 billion transaction physically clearing outside the U.S. order?
They're using specialized rupee-ruble ledgers. India and Russia are actively building financial architecture to settle trades in their local currencies, completely bypassing the US dollar and the SWIFT messaging system. India is holding direct talks with Russian Deputy Energy Minister Pavel Sorokin to expand this into LNG supplies as well.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a massive top-tier global economy prioritizing its own energy survival over Washington's sanctions regime. They are proving the US dollar is no longer mandatory for planetary trade. But are those permanent shifts or just desperate emergency bandages?
They are the foundation of a new operating system. And it's not just energy. Look at trade. Mexico recently implemented tariffs ranging from 5 to 50% on over 1,400 categories of Asian goods.
Right, to protect their local steel and textiles.
Yes. Now, in the old order, China would appeal to the US-backed World Trade Organization to mediate this dispute. Instead, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce is threatening direct, punishing trade reprisals against Mexico over what they estimate is $30 billion of impacted trade. We are seeing major economic power centers, New Delhi, Beijing, Mexico City, bypassing Washington entirely to negotiate, threaten, and trade with each other directly.
I hear what you're saying. I really do, but we have to distinguish between opportunistic friction and actual systemic stability. I understand why you point to India's local currency ledgers, but aren't those acts of sheer desperation?
I wouldn't call it desperation.
But can a global economy actually function efficiently on these emergency workarounds? In Africa, as we mentioned, countries are rationing power just to survive the week. That is not the birth of a sleek, decentralized, transactional world. That is the catastrophic breakdown of order.
But
hold on, think about the emergency smuggling and the shadow fleets, which the UK government, by the way, has just announced it is preparing to seize using direct military force. Those do not constitute a viable alternative global architecture.
see, what you call desperation is simply the catalyst for innovation. Yes, the shadow fleets and the rolling blackouts are immediate, messy crisis responses. But the banking infrastructure being built to facilitate India-Russia trade, or the bilateral enforcement mechanisms China and Mexico are testing against each other, those are permanent institutional shifts. The US dollar and US naval supremacy are no longer the undisputed operating systems of the world. They are just becoming one of several competing networks.
All right, well, let's test that theory by looking at how the world is handling the diplomacy of this crisis. Because from where I sit, traditional Western alliances are holding remarkably firm when the chips are down.
Are they?
I think so. We just saw the G7 foreign ministers meet in Vax-de-Cernay, France. You had U.S. Senator Marco Rubio present, actively and successfully aligning allied strategies on both the Iran toll booth crisis and the ongoing situation in Ukraine. The core of the free world is still operating as a cohesive dominant bloc to manage global instability.
Oh, I'm really glad you brought up the G7 in France. Because if you look closely at what actually happened there, the cracks in that alliance are glaring. The only reason the G7 looks cohesive is because they are actively purging dissenting voices.
Wait, how so?
France literally disinvited South African President Cyril Ramaphosa from that very summit, and they did it under intense direct pressure from the United States.
Well, let's unpack that. Why did France cave to U.S. pressure to kick South Africa out of the room?
Because South Africa is walking a geopolitical tightrope. They are a core member of BRICS, they maintain strong diplomatic and economic ties with Moscow and Beijing, and they have refused to align unconditionally with Washington's stance on Ukraine and the Middle East. So the U.S. essentially forced France to choose, either project a perfectly unified Western front or include the global South.
Right.
By forcing Ramaphosa's disinvite, the U.S. is actively alienating one of the most important economies in Africa. You cannot claim to maintain a quote-unquote global order if you are actively locking the majority of the globe out of the negotiating room whenever they disagree with you.
But let's be realistic about what the G7 actually is not the UN General Assembly. Its primary function is to coordinate economic and security policy among advanced, like-minded democracies.
Sure, but
Expecting the G7 to roll out the right carpet for nations that are heavily integrated with and running diplomatic cover for Russia and China fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of the alliance. You can't invite nations who are actively hedging with your adversaries to strategize your security policy.
Perhaps. But you have to accept the consequences of that exclusion, and the consequence is that the global south looks elsewhere for mediation, trade, and security. Because the West is shrinking its tent, we are seeing new mediators emerge that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Take Pakistan, for example.
Okay?
They are currently stepping up as a potential peacemaker and conduit between the U.S. and Iran in this very crisis.
I really struggle with that example. Pakistan has a severely fragile economy, a collapsing currency, and profound domestic political turmoil right now. How can a nation with its own existential domestic crises effectively mediate a global superpower standoff better than the established G7 framework? A diplomatic channel is only as strong as the leverage behind it. The U.S. and the G7 command the vast majority of the world's GDP and military capability.
You're measuring leverage strictly in terms of GDP, and frankly, that's an outdated metric in a multipolar world.
Is it?
Absolutely. Leverage is also about geography and access. The Global South doesn't need a mediator with a $20 trillion economy. They need a mediator who can actually get Tehran on the phone. Pakistan shares a massive, porous border with Iran. They have deep cultural and historical ties to the region while also maintaining a complex, ongoing military relationship with the United States.
Well, they do have access, I'll grant you that.
They have the leverage of relevance. The fact that Trump even publicly acknowledged those 10 Pakistani-flagged oil boats proves that Washington recognizes Islamabad's utility here. The G7 has all the GDP in the world, but it lacks trust in Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and increasingly Pretoria.
Okay, but what about the security side of this alternative order? We are seeing reports of Belarus gifting weapons to North Korea's Kim Jong-un after signing a bilateral friendship treaty. Surely you aren't suggesting that a partnership between Minsk and Pyongyang, symbolized by gifting a gun, represents a credible alternative security architecture. That is a partnership of pariahs, not a new world order.
It doesn't need to be a formalized alliance like NATO to be effective. It's a transactional network. When Belarus, North Korea, Iran, and Russia begin integrating their military logistics and supply chains, they don't need to share a grand democratic ideology. They just need a shared interest in bypassing U.S. containment. And right now, that shared interest is stronger than ever.
We have covered incredible ground today. Let's summarize where we stand on this. My view remains that the intense planetary pain caused by the Hormuz blockade proves the irreplaceable nature of U.S. maritime and diplomatic leadership. When 2,000 vessels are stranded and we are looking at the mechanics of fertilizer shortages threatening global food supplies, the emergency responses we see, like African fuel rationing and shadow fleets, are symptoms of systemic chaos.
Right.
They are not the foundation of a new order. Without U.S. deterrence and frameworks like the Witkoff proposal or targeted military pauses, the international system faces total breakdown.
And my position is that this crisis has brilliantly exposed the hard limits of American power. The U.S. simply cannot order the Strait open anymore. The toll booth remains operational. It's funded by shadow banking. And in the shadow of this crisis, we are witnessing the rapid acceleration of a world where nations are charting independent paths.
Yeah.
From India actively bypassing the dollar to buy Russian crude, to Mexico and China sparring over tariffs outside the WTO, to South Africa being pushed to forge its own diplomatic course. The multipolar world isn't some future theory. It is already here, and it is operating right under the nose of the old order.
I think where we absolutely converge today is the recognition that the current crisis radiating out of the Middle East is a profound watershed moment. It is fundamentally stress testing and reshaping global trade, energy supply chains, and international diplomacy.
Without a doubt, the tectonic plates of planetary economics are shifting violently, and no region, whether it's Latin America, Europe, or Asia, is insulated from the tremors.
We clearly remain in disagreement over whether the dust will ultimately settle with a reinvigorated U.S.-led order pulling the global economy back from the brink, or if we will transition permanently into a fragmented, transactional, multipolar reality. As the 10-day strike pause ticks down and the markets react to every White House and IRGC statement, there is much more to observe. We started this discussion by looking at a $2 million toll booth in the ocean. How the world chooses to pay that toll or dismantle it will define the next century of geopolitics. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence. Thank you for joining us.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.